I learned that word from Randy. Everybody's y'all, if there's only one of them. I've had an extraordinary good fortune in terms of the number of people that I've had the opportunity to meet and talk with here. I've met so many people, and so many people are just providing input, you know. One guy comes up the other day and we start talking about allodial titles, and he said, well, I'll tell you how we've been doing it, and it's been working. And I said, whoa, that's better than what I've been doing. And another guy comes along and he says, yeah, but there's one other thing you can do, and you can speed the process up. I thought, well, wait a minute. Process went from 6 months to 4 months to 90 days to 60 days, and now we got it down to 3 weeks. I figured at that rate, the state's going to come to us day after tomorrow and start handing them out, you see. And it's incredible. I mean, people have just been providing input and feedback, and guys coming up with little-known court decisions and statutes and acts and methods, ways of getting from A to Z. You know, it just proves that no, I don't have a lock on everything there is to know about truth. Now, before I get into the main body of what I wanted to talk about tonight, whereas last night was somewhat critical of a few things. A lot of things, all right, a lot of things. Whereas last night was a little bit critical of a lot of things, tonight I want to set forth for you an agenda for the 21st century, for us to begin thinking about and praying about and considering, because where there is no vision, the people perish, as the scripture says. And I want to add a piece of the puzzle of this vision that we should all have, that we should all propagate in order to restore true law and order to this nation once again, that we might become a beacon again unto all nations. And how many of you ever seen in person the Golden Gate Bridge? All right. I mean, actually stood on the abutments or something like that outside of a car, okay, and looked at the Golden Gate Bridge. How many of you have seen the original plaque, the dedicatory plaque that was on the Golden Gate Bridge? I don't know what plaque is on there now, but I remember that the original plaque, of which I used to see a casting on a friend of mine's wall, he had a replica of it, and it said, the Golden Gateway for the gospel to the east. Somehow or another, the present context of the Golden Gate Bridge seems to be somewhat foreign to that. But that incident, nevertheless, portrays something of the idea of a vision that was larger than just the bridge itself, that the architect originally had for it. And tonight, the real vision, whatever it might turn out to be in terms of God's providence, is certainly going to be a lot larger than anything I may present here. This is just a piece to try and suggest something to you. Now, one guy came up to me the other night, and he said, yeah, John, you know, I think there's a lot of good things in the Bible. There really is. Yeah, of course, I can't go along with this biblical law stuff. You understand? I mean, it's so negative, all them thou shalt nots. And I said, well, that's the beauty of it. And he says, what? And I said, yes, you see, there's a difference between the way man writes law and God writes law. Because when God writes a law, he says, thou shalt not do this. This one specific thing, you can't do that. Everything else is permitted. When man writes a law, he says, thou mayest do this. Everything else is prohibited. Now, which of the two forms of law do you think maximizes one's liberty? God's law is always very specific, always very simple. In fact, the Ten Commandments are the constitution of the Christian church. And until 150 years ago, they were seen and interpreted that way by the vast majority of all Christian religions. And that of the 664 laws in the Old and New Testament, 10 represented the summary of the law, the fundamental principles upon which the other 654 laws held. They had their foundation in those laws. And I remember when I ran for the California State Senate in 1984, the newspapers and a few other people jumped on my case for being a Christian and propagating the idea of biblical law as binding on all men and all ages, you know. And one newspaper reporter, very arrogantly, why, he comes up to me and he says, really, Mr. Saunders, that's my legal name, by the way. Quade's my phony one. I just use that for the other stuff, okay. And for, you know, Expo programs and things. But he comes up to me, he says, really, Mr. Saunders, he says, you couldn't expect anyone in his right mind to want to live in a society in which this biblical law was the law of the land. And I said, well, I don't know. That's not for me to answer except for myself. But I can say this. I know that the state of California, the year previous, had passed 1,360 new laws in one session of the legislature. In the whole Bible, there's only 664 laws. It just seemed like to me there was a certain degree of contrast between the two. Now, I have to be honest with you, I didn't expect the man from the media, from the Stockton Record, to see that difference. Given his stance, it was like he was looking at with one eye, and the page that he should have been looking at was over here. And I had a real problem with these people because of that. But it was then that we started to formulate an agenda. Where there is no vision, the people perish. And so I started putting out ideas to people, what we have to do, all right, in order to reform America. Because it's self-evident that though their leadership may not know it, black people and Orientals in this country do not stand on the same footing as white people do when it comes to standing before the bar. Now, the truth of the matter is, in my opinion, all these arguments about racism and everything else are smoke. It's nothing but smoke and mirrors. They're emotional hot buttons that the media pushes for its own reasons, called ratings points, because ratings points translate into dollars. And various other leaders keep pushing these buttons because it translates into response from direct mail campaigns and appeals for money. They all keep pushing these buttons and promoting the division between races because it serves their best interest. And if the problem goes away, they'd all be out looking for a job like the rest of us. You know, I mean, I had a welfare lady one time, many years ago, tried to come to my house and tell me how to run my life and my kids and deal with my kids and everything else, you know. And I said, lady, why don't you go someplace where there's a problem and deal with that? Well, of course, then I had to apologize. And I said, I'm sorry, ma'am, I realized that if you really found the problem and solved it, you'd be out of a job. She took offense at that. Well, I find the same mentality exists in all the neo-Marxist, left-wing or liberal or slightly to the left of center groups and all the far-right and ultra-right. It said, I don't care about being left or right or center. I only care about being right. Being right in terms of God's standard, because that's the only one that counts. And I've studied the question, and this may offend some people. I've studied this question very carefully. Time and again, I've come back to it.